The issue of substance abuse has been a topic of debate in recent years. People argue about what constitutes a hard drug. Canada and the US have legalized marijuana for personal use, whilst British Columbia has gone one step further by legalizing any hard drugs less than 2.5 grams. In Vancouver, the issue of drug abuse manifests itself in the downtown east side. As a young kid, I would occasionally go down there with my parents, usually to run errands. And as we walked through the area, we would often pass people stood up, bent over. A good portion of these people bent over on the street were First Nations. Now, this observation of mine might not seem very important, but when people begin to understand that the downtown Vancouver east side contains a heavy Indigenous demographic, then it does become more significant. For this documentary, I want to explore the stereotype of Indigenous peoples being substance abusers and how that affects the way we perceive this group. According to the DRS, Drug Rehab Services, many Native American communities across Canada are concerned about the issue of substance abuse. They are also concerned about the continuation of colonization, disapproving approaches to mental illness, societal narratives to substance abuse, and the creation of generational trauma by residential schools. In one article published on their website, the DRS stated that Indigenous people suffer from substance abuse, and that this affliction is largely due to the First Nations people who were severely traumatized after their experience at the residential schools, and sought or found comfort from this suffering by taking drugs and alcohol. According to research regarding the relation between residential schools and substance abuse, they found that people who reported being sexually or physically assaulted in their childhood had an increased likelihood of substance abuse problems later on in life. Another study that was conducted by University of Quebec at Chicoutimi interviewed 358 Indigenous participants, 28.5% of which claimed to be residential school survivors, 35.2% claimed to have been sexually abused as a child, whilst 34% claimed to have been physically abused as a child. What these two studies and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report highlighted was that the Indigenous peoples of Canada continue to suffer past traumas that the residential school system inflicted upon them. Racism has also played a role. According to the First Nations Regional Longitudinal Health Survey, they found that 38% of the Indigenous participants had at least one experience of racism over the past year, and 63% found that it had some effect on their self-esteem. The type of racism that Indigenous people usually suffer involves the use of stereotypes. These rather unfavorable characterizations or stereotypes include the perception of Indigenous peoples being associated with substance abuse, violence, unemployment, and government financial dependency. The mainstream media may have also done its job in helping to shape the population's misconception of the modern Indigenous person. This form of media bias takes place when the media chooses stories that focus around the social and economic challenges that Indigenous communities face, while excluding ones involving discrimination. The First Nations Information Governance Centers found the main concern for community well-being on reserves was the misuse of alcohol and drugs. They found this through a national longitudinal survey that they conducted during 2008 and 2010, when they consulted with First Nations communities on this topic. In 2011, the Assembly of First Nations found First Nations reports indicated that higher rates of physical and emotional abuse occur around family members, especially young and old. Communities with higher percentages of substance abuse also have higher tendencies of suicide, violent crimes, illegal activity, and other forms of abuse. In 2010, the Chiefs of Ontario found that some First Nations communities have reported rates of opioid addiction as high as 43% within their communities, rising as much as 85% nationally according to Health Canada in 2011. The Chiefs of Ontario also found that these statistics came with other problems, such as the involvement of child and family services, struggles with law enforcement, and absence from places of work, education, and community engagement. The 2008 to 2010 First Nations Regional Health Survey, which was done by First Nations Information Governance Centre in 2012, revealed that among First Nations people aged 18 and older, living on reserves or in northern First Nations communities, 4.7% admitted the illegal use of heroin or prescription opioids, including morphine, methadone, and codeine, without a prescription, and 5.7% admitted the use of non-prescribed uses of sedatives or sleeping pills, including diazepam and oxazepam, for the past year. They also found that amongst Indigenous youth aged between the ages of 12 and 17, 1.3% admitted the use of illegal or prescription opioids during the previous 12 months, and 2.2% reported non-prescribed use of sedatives or sleeping pills. These studies go to show how much the opioid crisis is affecting the Indigenous peoples of Canada, with the dysfunction that it brings to their communities affecting not only the older generation, but also the younger. The members of the Indigenous community who are most involved in addressing the challenges of substance abuse are, of course, the adults. Many of the Indigenous people that I see slumped in the street in the downtown east side of Vancouver are part of generations that were born in the latter half of the 20th century, many of whom would have had the experience of a residential school. According to the sources I came across, after leaving the residential school system, many of these people would be both angry and depressed at their time there, and would have self-medicated with either alcohol, opioids, or both. Because of the trauma these communities have suffered and the addiction issues they created, together with the major distrust that they have of government, these elements start to create a trickle-down effect. This trickle gravitates itself towards the ground, inevitably hitting the bottom tier of their hierarchy, the children. Because of the adult generation's irrational choices, the children eventually get influenced by their decisions and start to do the exact same things that their parents did due to the parents' lack of control, which ultimately help to start the cycle of substance abuse all over again. With that in mind, the next step is to figure out how this cycle can be broken. The Honoring Our Strengths framework model is a guide to the forming of services at all levels to help support communities, together with regional and national responses to addiction and substance issues, which ultimately achieves wellness for all First Nations individuals. A cardinal component of this framework is for all service providers to employ a culturally competent and safe approach to help support the diverse needs of First Nations people, whether they be on or off a reserve. The wellness they are referring to is separate from the Western world's view of health, in the fact that it is founded on a holistic approach to well-being that enables the balance of the spirit, mind, body, and the emotion of humans. The practice of wellness requires culture to be at the center. Cultural intervention addresses the value and intertwining of the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional sides of man altogether. The next obvious thing to ask is, how is culture intended to address substance abuse? This can be explained in three essential areas where culture is central. Culturally competent. Cultural competency requires that all service providers' attitudes and worldviews are in tune with the cultural differences of First Nations peoples. They also need to be enlightened and open-minded to the culture and environment that their clients come from, which is then practically translated to help further delivery of health services. Culturally safe. Cultural safety exists beyond the cultural acknowledgement and respecting of boundaries within services, but being aware of structural, cultural, and historical differences, as well as power relationships within care and availability to services. It calls for all service providers and the system as a whole to participate in a continuous self-reflection and structural growth to better respond to the needs of First Nations people. Cultural relevancy. Cultural relevancy requires that the service provider conduct themselves in a culturally competent manner, and that any action taken respects the diversity of the individual, family, and community. Some medical professionals might find it difficult to work with unregulated occupations, such as cultural practitioners or elders. Other divisions can also arise, like conflicting worldviews, a lack of motivation or understanding of Indigenous and Western knowledge, jurisdictional differences, and deficiency in funds. All these barriers can be avoided through mutual agreement and anticipated results. The benefit of using the Honoring Our Strengths framework model is that we can transfer and implement it into the outside world and set up similar services for substance abusers like the ones we see in the downtown east side. As this was a Canadian creation, it's natural that it starts off in one of the larger cities like Vancouver, which will then hopefully spread to other provinces and territories. If this model takes off and is successful, other countries could see its success and adopt a similar model. At the end of the day, I don't know what's going to happen with the government's plan to stop substance abuse in Canada. But if they don't try to amend things now, it will just get more difficult down the road.